Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And it's titled, Everything is Meaningless. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labours at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea. Yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome. More than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on humankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned too that this is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Well, all of you who were feeling happy earlier on in the service, after hearing that, I'm not sure how happy you could feel now. The teacher who writes this book of Ecclesiastes for us, we understand that it's Solomon, that it's Solomon's wisdom, and that he has set it down for us. Where does he find meaning? He says everything is utterly meaningless. Everything under the sun. You might think, well, why is this here in the Bible? Why do we have these words? And yet Solomon, the teacher, is facing up to the real questions of life. And if you look further through Ecclesiastes, you'll see that meaningless is actually something of a catchphrase for him. John Humphreys, the former BBC presenter, wrote a book called In God We Doubt. And he writes about how he came as a young boy to think about the big questions in life. And he says that once when he was riding home on a school trip from Aberystwyth, He was feeling sick and leaning out of the back of the bus, looking at the road, and he remembered thinking, what was the point of being born if all there was to look forward was dying? Cheerful. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher. John Humphreys in that story is a kindred spirit. And yet, not afraid to ask that big question about meaning in life, even if it is a bleak answer. Well, let's look a little bit more in detail about what the teacher says. And in one sense, I think in that section, kind of verses 2 down to 11, it's almost as though he's summarising his answer with a kind of a shrug. Everything is meaningless. It's a bit like that infuriating response that you sometimes get from a teenager or even older when they say, whatever. You think, gosh, why won't you engage with me? But actually there's something, a key phrase in this passage. It comes in verse 9 and actually we see it in verse 3 and throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, under the sun. It's used more than 35 times in the whole book and 4 times in this chapter. Under the sun. The teacher says in verse 14, I've seen all the things that are done under the sun. Under the sun. What does he mean by that? Well, he means if you keep your feet firmly on the ground, if you look at everything that is under the sun, everything that is in creation, if there you search for meaning, all you can do is shrug. Verse 4, generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. Nothing really changes. The sun rises and the sun sets. It hurries back to where it rises. There'll be another day. He talks about the streams flowing into the sea and then going back to where they come. Perhaps he doesn't understand the whole of the water cycle of precipitation and rainfall and clouds. But he does understand that there is this circularity to the water on the earth. You see, you can be a brilliant scientist, you could be a naturalist, you can be a David Attenborough and film as many Planet Earth series as you like. You can marvel, you can wonder, you can gasp at what you see. But however much you study the world of nature, you're not going to find the meaning to life. At least not one that satisfies. And so the teacher says all things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. As often as we get older, our hearing gets more difficult, doesn't it? I've actually had hearing problems since I was quite a young man. And there are times at which my hearing is worse than others. Usually after I've had a cold, and I'm in that place at the moment. So if I look at you afterwards when you talk to me and I'm just kind of nodding and smiling, I probably haven't heard what you've said. Particularly if you're speaking to this ear, which is worse at the moment. So my ear doesn't always get its fill at the moment, and it can be quite infuriating, especially for the people close to me when they're trying to talk to me and I don't hear them. And because of the nature of my hearing loss, what it tends to mean is that my voice volume drops as well. So often age-related deafness, people tend to shout, but because mine is different, I tend to go quiet. And so people say to me, "Speak up, Nick, I can't hear you, speak up." But to me it sounds really loud. And so that's why I tone my voice down. But hopefully you're hearing me okay this morning. My mother used to say to me that she could never hear me apart from when I was preaching. So she enjoyed listening to me preaching. I'm not sure what that meant, really. But the teacher says the eye doesn't have enough of seeing, or the ear, it's full of hearing. And we all know those people that search for fulfillment in life by visiting far-flung places around the world. But there's always somewhere else to go, something else to see, something else to hear. And last year's holiday of a lifetime is succeeded by this year's holiday of a lifetime. What has been will be again. What's been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. It's a famous phrase that's come into our language, hasn't it? The same old routine, a different day, but there's nothing new. History repeats itself. Steve Turner wrote, "It has to, nobody listens." Or somebody else has said, history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. Is that the right way around? Or was it the other way around? Anyway, history repeats itself. It's interesting. I first preached on this passage 9 years ago, I think. And some of the things that I had noted down are exactly the same as today. So what did I put down 9 years ago? Fighting in Gaza. Trouble in the economy. Shops closing. And then I wrote after that, there's nothing new under the sun. And here we are today. And I could just read that line out again, couldn't I? There is nothing new under the sun. But there is some hope at the end of this, don't worry. It's a little bit depressing to start with. Because, verse 11, there's no remembrance of people of old. Who is going to remember us after we are gone? Well, the people that love us will remember us. But then when they've gone, who remembers us? There's only a very few people that are written about in the history books. Just been listening to a podcast this weekend. I'm a bit of a politics geek, and this is all about the political and economic crisis of 1973, 1974. Some of you may remember it. 1973 is the year I was born, and I was surprised at how much happened in 1973. The Yom Kippur War, the oil price shock, the miners' strike, and then going into 74 was the beginning of the 3-day week, and 1974 was the year of the 2 general elections. Well, we might remember the name of the Prime Minister from 1973. Does anyone remember? Ted Heath. Yeah. He didn't last for the... Well, he served almost a whole term, and then was famous for carping on the backbenches when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. A Prime Minister might be remembered, but do we remember the names of the people that served in his cabinet? Do you remember his ministers? Do you remember the MPs? All of these names are so easily forgotten. When I think back to my ordination service 25 years ago, I think pretty much everybody that was speaking in the service, apart from me, is now dead. And it's only 25 years ago. I remember them. And probably A lot of people who are at the service might remember them, or they might struggle with some of the names. But the names get quickly forgotten. Richard Dawkins, in his book River Out of Eden, says this: "The universe we observe has precisely the proportions we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." That's not very encouraging either, is it? As one of the evangelists, you might say, of the scientific reductionist, that's my description, reductionist method, that there is nothing other than what can be observed and seen. But he's in agreement with the preacher, the teacher, the Solomon, who has put these words down, that actually if we look at all that is observed, then there is no meaning. So what does Solomon do? In verse 12 he says that he was king over Israel. In verse 13 he says that he applied his mind to study and explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on humankind. So he's saying that God has given him wisdom, and so he is going to apply that in the way that he looks at the world. He is going to see what he can understand from everything he can observe. And so he looks and he sees that people are chasing after the wind. He sees that what is crooked cannot be straightened. He sees that actually even the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge, trying to understand wisdom, and he adds in madness and folly, even all of that becomes a chasing after the wind. Now the teacher is no fool, but he won't allow wisdom to give glib answers. Now, it's quite easy in the books of wisdom of the Bible to look in Ecclesiastes and to look in Proverbs and to find a nice little catchphrase that we can use and give an easy answer to something. But actually, there is a lot more depth to those books than that. There's a lot more depth to Ecclesiastes because he is seeing what lies above and beyond the sun, as well as what is under the sun. So he says the wise have eyes in their heads while fools walk in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. He says, like the fool, the wise too must die. Well, that takes us right back to John Humphreys at the beginning, doesn't it? At the back of the bus. What's the point of being born is all that happens is that you look forward to dying. At the end of the day, the wisest teacher ends up being food for worms or a pile of ashes, just like the fool does. Well, we could put it more tactfully than that, but that's the gist of what he is saying. He says, what is crooked cannot be straightened, what is lacking cannot be counted. It sounds a little bit despairing, but actually the teacher begins to see purpose and meaning even in this. In fact, later on in chapter 7, verse 13, he says, consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? Sometimes we try to simplify things, and we find it easier to see things straightened out. But the teacher says, actually, God has made some things crooked. That might not be how we would put it, but it's how it says it in Ecclesiastes. It's as though he's saying that God has made the world this way so that actually we cannot explain it. And there is a frustration in not being able to work out what has been built into it. And perhaps it's part of what Paul comes to talk about in the New Testament when he says that God is subjecting the creation to frustration in Romans chapter 8. And God is and it was very good of Genesis chapter 1. And more than that, we're not the people of Genesis chapter 1 either. Because we're not those that are living in the completeness and the fullness of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 when the man and the woman walk in the Garden of Eden and they talk with God at the breezy time of the day. It's not like that anymore. But instead we are in this frustrated time when we're waiting for the restoration of creation. And so there is this twist in creation now. And it's why when Richard Dawkins sets up his great God of reason, he misses two vital points. That although we have a world that can be studied and explored and marvelled at, it cannot ultimately be explained without reference to God. And of course, secondly, I suppose that the way that creation is now in this frustrating time, that all of human thinking is affected by that, even a mighty brain such as his. Verse 18, the teacher says, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell were probably two of the greatest brains of the 20th century in the English-speaking world. I suppose Albert Einstein technically didn't have English as his first language, but in terms of the kind of the academic English-speaking world. And they got together and they wrote a little booklet which had this sentence within it. We have found that the men who know the most are the most gloomy. Which is exactly what Ecclesiastes is saying here. The more knowledge, the more grief. So not just the teenagers shrug, but perhaps when the clever people get together and study the world, they end up with a sigh. So, what's the answer? Well, we're not going to push too much further forward in the book today, and maybe the next time I preach, I'll preach a bit further forwards in it. But there is hope. The teacher is not an atheist. He does not live without God. His wisdom came to him from God. You may remember the story of Solomon, that God came to him through the prophet and said, what is it that you want more than anything else to be king over Israel? And Solomon said, wisdom. And then God says, well, because you have asked for wisdom and you haven't asked for wealth and power, I'm going to give you wealth and power anyway, as well as wisdom to use that. So we know that Solomon was a man who to some extent wanted to follow in the footsteps of his father David and to serve God as far as he was able to. And so Solomon knows that there is much more to life than just all that is under the sun. But he wants us to know that we cannot find meaning completely in everything under the sun. We have to look beyond that too. And so what he wants us to do is to pick up on what he's saying and look beyond the sun. Who is it that created the sun? Who is it that created the world? That is the one in whom we can find our meaning. T.S. Eliot said that humankind cannot bear very much reality. And the teacher, Solomon, will not allow us to short-circuit reality. He doesn't want us to rush to answers. He wants us to search for God. If we look a little bit ahead into chapter 2 and verse 26, we read, "To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness." Wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. This does pick up on the talk you were doing earlier, actually, Clive. The second half of the verse says, "To the sinner he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth, to the one to hand it over to the one who pleases God." That's very interesting. Where does Solomon's wisdom come from? It comes from God. He acknowledges that. So look under the sun. You'll just get a shrug and a sigh. But there is a wisdom that comes from beyond the sun, the Lord of all creation, our living and loving Lord, who is over all things and who engages with creation, who becomes human in Jesus of Nazareth, who shows us his love as he dies on the cross. Look for meaning under the sun, we won't find it. But if we look for meaning in the one God sent, in his Son, then we will find fulfillment. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, we read, "What good is it for you to gain the whole world and yet forfeit your soul?" Jesus says, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the good news will save it." Saved not just from sin and death, but from pointlessness and meaninglessness in this life, as well as a godless eternity. So this week, as I said at the beginning, I am in a bit of a reflective mood, really, thinking back 25 years, thinking about the things that have changed in the world, in the church, and in my life in 25 years, and the things that are the same. There are significant things happening this week for me: graduation, celebrating anniversary, and for those of you who know, the Baptist Union Council are making a decision this week that will have a big impact on how I can continue to serve in the Baptist Union. But meaning for me, I hope and trust, is not in what I see around me, but it's exactly the same as it was 25 years ago, where I seek meaning in God. The same as when I became a Christian. I don't care to think how many years ago. When I was about 6 or 7, when I was baptised at the age of 13 in 1986, when I responded to God's call to ministry when I was 18. But I find my meaning in serving God. And even though I don't know where he is always leading me, and even though my life is not always wonderful and happy, sometimes there are dark times, as there are for all of us. But meaning and fulfillment is found in knowing God, knowing that I am held by him, made by him, and sustained by him. Perhaps just finish off by illustrating that from a part of my work. I work as a chaplain in the hospitals in Manchester, and I'm often called into the hospital in the middle of the night for a patient who is dying or who has died. And what the family present at the bedside want to know is that there is meaning in life and in death, but it's not insignificant. And actually, many, I would say 90% of the people that I am called to would not be churchgoers. They would not be regular church attenders. But at that moment, they want to find meaning that can be brought to them by a Christian minister who's able to talk to them, speak to them the words of God from the Bible, and who can stand with them and pray with them at that crucial time as somebody is dying or who has died. And so actually I would say that even for people who perhaps don't think about these things a great deal for a lot of the time, that when the rubber hits the road, when it really matters, they know that meaning is elsewhere. So let's just pray for a moment. Living and loving God, we thank you that meaning is found in you and with you and through you, in the way that we live our lives, in the way that we face death, in the way that we serve you. And so, Lord, today we commit ourselves again to your service. And may we know your power, and may we know your hope in all that we do. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.